summer of 1945. Europe celebrates victory over fascism, but in the Far East, the war continues. A secret operation is being prepared that will decide the fate of the entire Pacific theater of war. Marshal Malinovsky is given a task that seems impossible: to lead a million-strong army across the Gobi Desert and defeat the invincible Kwantung Army. How did one strategic move change the course of world history? How did a simple peasant's son become the author of the most daring operation of World War II? Subscribe to the channel to learn more incredible stories about the heroes who changed the world. Write in the comments, do you think the Manchurian Operation was really necessary after the use of atomic weapons against Japan? Or was it a show of force before the start of the Cold War? On November 23, 1898, in the small village of Malinovka in the Yekaterinoslav Governorate, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the greatest military leaders of the 20th century. Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky was born into a peasant family, where from childhood he learned hard physical labor and how to overcome difficulties. His father, Yakov Malinovsky, was a simple farmer, and his mother was a housewife and raised the children. From an early age, the future marshal showed remarkable abilities for learning and organization. At the local school, he quickly stood out among his peers for his quick wit and leadership qualities. However, fate decreed that peaceful peasant life would be interrupted by the roar of World War I. In 1915, 17-year-old Rodion was drafted into the army of the Russian Empire. Service in the Tsarist army became a real school of military affairs for the young Malinovsky. He was assigned to the 56th Zhytomyr Infantry Regiment, where he began his service as a private. Even then, his commanders noted his discipline, bravery, and ability to quickly grasp military wisdom. In a short time, Rodion rose to the rank of junior non-commissioned officer. The future marshal received his first baptism of fire on the German front. In the fierce battles near Brusilov, he proved himself to be a courageous and decisive warrior. It was here, in the trenches of World War I, that the character of a man who would command millions of soldiers 30 years later was formed. Malinovsky was wounded and shell-shocked, but each time he returned to the front lines. The revolutionary events of 1917 found Rodion Yakovlevich in France, where he had been sent as part of the Russian Expeditionary Corps. It was there that he first encountered new methods of warfare, studied the tactics of the French army, and gained invaluable experience in working with allies. This experience would come in handy a quarter of a century later, when he was planning the most complex operations of the Great Patriotic War. After returning to Russia, Malinovsky made a decision that determined his entire future. He joined the Red Army. In 1918, he was already fighting against the White Army on the southern front of the Civil War. His military talent did not go unnoticed. The young commander was quickly promoted to more responsible positions. Between the wars, Malinovsky actively studied military science, completed advanced training courses for command personnel, and then graduated from the Frunze Military Academy. He closely followed the development of military thought around the world and studied the experience of wars in Spain and China. He was particularly interested in the use of tank formations and the interaction of different branches of the armed forces. The summer of 1942 was a time of great trials for the Red Army. German troops, concentrating enormous forces in the south, began Operation Blau, an offensive against the Caucasus and the Volga. In these critical conditions, Lieutenant General Malinovsky took command of the Southern Front, one of the most difficult sections of the Soviet-German front. The situation that awaited the new commander was catastrophic. The enemy had overwhelming superiority in manpower and equipment. German tank wedges, supported by powerful aviation, methodically broke through the defenses of the Soviet troops. Under the blows of Army Group South, the units of the Southern Front were forced to retreat, suffering heavy losses. Malinovsky understood that in the current circumstances, the main task was to preserve combat-ready units and prevent their complete encirclement. This required not only military skill, but also tremendous courage, because every decision to withdraw troops could be interpreted as cowardice or betrayal. The general took on a huge responsibility, knowing that a mistake could cost the lives of thousands of soldiers. On July 22, 1942, the troops of the Southern Front were forced to leave Rostov-on-Don. This city was of strategic importance as a gateway to the Caucasus, and its loss was a painful blow to the Soviet command. However, Malinovsky managed to organize the retreat in such a way that the main forces of the front avoided encirclement and retained their ability to continue resistance. There is a version that the general made the decision to withdraw the troops at his own risk, without waiting for an official order from the high command. If this is true, then Malinovsky demonstrated the qualities of a true military leader: the ability to take responsibility in a critical situation and act in the interests of preserving the army, even at the risk of his own career. The retreat from Rostov was only the beginning of difficult trials. On July 28th, Stalin issued his famous order number 227, "Not a step back," which sharply tightened discipline in the army. On the same day, the Southern Front was disbanded and its troops transferred to the North Caucasus Front. Malinovsky was appointed commander of the Don Group of forces. The new formation included the 12th, 37th, and 51st Armies, all of which had been severely battered in previous battles. There were virtually no tanks left, ammunition was catastrophically scarce, and German aircraft completely dominated the skies. Under such conditions, it would take a miracle to stop the enemy. Malinovsky was tasked with defending the Stavropol direction, one of the key routes to the Caucasus. The German Tank Corps of the 1st Panzer Army delivered deep, cutting blows, easily bypassing the pockets of Soviet defense. On August 3rd, the enemy broke into Voroshilovsk, and on August 5th, it took Novinominsk on the march. It was not possible to restore a continuous line of defense. The defeats of the summer of 1942 became a harsh but invaluable school of military art for Malinovsky. Each failure, each forced retreat, became the subject of deep analysis and a source of experience that would later be useful in the decisive battles of the war. The general understood that modern warfare required fundamentally new approaches to planning and conducting operations. The main lesson Malinovsky learned from the disastrous retreat was the importance of supplying troops. German successes were largely due to their superiority in aviation, artillery, and tanks. Soviet troops often showed miracles of heroism, but heroism without adequate technical support could not compensate for the enemy's material superiority. The second important conclusion concerned the organization of troop command in a highly mobile war. German tank wedges moved at speeds that often exceeded the capabilities of the Soviet communications and command system. Headquarters were unable to keep up with the rapidly changing situation, which led to decisions being made on the basis of outdated information. Malinovsky also realized the critical importance of coordination between different branches of the military. German tactics were based on close coordination between tanks, aircraft, and infantry. Each branch of the military complemented the others, creating a synergistic effect. Soviet troops, on the other hand, often acted in isolation, which significantly reduced their effectiveness. The general paid particular attention to studying German methods of conducting reconnaissance and ensuring the secrecy of operational preparations. The enemy demonstrated an amazing ability to achieve tactical surprise by concentrating large forces in the right place at the right time. These skills would become one of Malinovsky's main trump cards in future operations. Analyzing the reasons for the failures, the commander came to the conclusion that a radical change in the approach to training officers was necessary. Many commanders were not prepared for the conditions of modern maneuver warfare, having become accustomed to the static forms of warfare of World War I and the Civil War. The period of temporary setbacks became a time of intensive self-education for Malinovsky. He studied captured German documents, analyzed the enemy's tactical techniques, and communicated with captured German officers in an effort to understand the logic behind their actions. This experience proved invaluable in planning his own offensive operations. The general also understood the importance of the psychological factor in modern warfare. The retreat inevitably affected the morale of the troops, and special efforts were required to maintain their fighting spirit. It was necessary to find a balance between strict discipline and care for the people, between demandingness and understanding of objective difficulties. Malinovsky made an important conclusion about the role of terrain in modern warfare. The open spaces of the steppes gave enormous advantages to the side, with superior tanks and aircraft. This meant that for a successful defense, it was necessary to make maximum use of natural obstacles: rivers, forests, mountains, and urban buildings. In the fall of 1942, Malinovsky's name became associated with one of the turning points of the Great Patriotic War, the Battle of Stalingrad. In September, he took command of the 66th Army, which was defending the northern part of the great city on the Volga. This appointment gave the general an opportunity to put into practice all the lessons he had learned from the bitter experience of the summer retreat. The 66th Army was tasked with preventing the enemy from breaking through to the Volga north of Stalingrad and thus preventing the complete encirclement of the city's defenders. The Army's positions ran through the industrial enterprises of northern Stalingrad, an area crisscrossed by factory buildings, railroad tracks, and warehouses. Malinovsky immediately assessed the tactical advantages of the urban terrain for defense. Every building could become a fortress, every street an anti-tank line. The city's industrial infrastructure created many natural obstacles for German tanks and limited the use of aviation. The Army commander personally toured the front lines, studying the terrain and determining the most advantageous locations for artillery and anti-tank weapons. He understood that in urban combat, the initiative of junior commanders and the ability of soldiers to act independently, away from the main forces, were of decisive importance. Malinovsky paid particular attention to organizing cooperation with neighboring units. The experience of previous months had shown that the fragmentation of the actions of various units often led to gaps in the defense, which the enemy immediately exploited. The general insisted on the creation of a unified system of artillery fire control and coordination of the actions of all branches of the armed forces. Malinovsky's troops participated in repelling fierce enemy attacks on the northern outskirts of Stalingrad. German troops, having suffered huge losses in the battles for the city center, tried to bypass the main pockets of resistance and break through to the Volga through industrial areas. Every factory and every workshop became an arena for bloody battles. At the end of November 1942, Malinovsky received a new appointment. He became commander of the Second Guards Army. This unit was intended to participate in the planned counteroffensive near Stalingrad. Operation Uranus was supposed to change the course of the entire war, and Malinovsky was to play one of the key roles in it. The Second Guards Army was formed from the best units that had gone through the crucible of the Stalingrad battles. These were battle-hardened units whose officers and soldiers had gained invaluable experience in combat against German troops. Malinovsky understood that he had at his disposal an excellent tool for delivering a decisive blow. Preparations for the counteroffensive were carried out in the strictest secrecy. Troops were concentrated only during the dark hours of the day, and all movements were carefully camouflaged. Malinovsky personally supervised every detail of the preparations, understanding that the success of the operation depended largely on achieving tactical surprise. After the victory at Stalingrad, new prospects for a strategic offensive opened up for the Red Army. Malinovsky, now a colonel general, was given command of the Southern Front, renamed from the Stalingrad Front. Ahead lay the tasks of liberating the Donbas and the eastern regions of Ukraine, the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. The Donbas was of enormous strategic importance for both the USSR and Germany. The region's coal mines and metallurgical plants were vital to the war economy. The German command understood this perfectly well and created a powerful system of fortifications in the Donbas, known as the Eastern Wall. The enemy turned every large settlement into a fortified area. Mine slag heaps were used as observation posts and firing positions, and industrial buildings were turned into pillboxes and dugouts. Particularly powerful fortifications were built in Rostov-on-Don, Taganrog, Mariupol, and other key cities in the region. Malinovsky understood that a frontal assault on fortified positions would lead to unjustifiably high losses. He developed tactics based on maneuvering and bypassing the main centers of enemy resistance. The main goal was not to capture cities at any cost, but to encircle and destroy German groups in open terrain. A key element of the new tactics was the massive use of artillery and aviation to suppress enemy resistance points. Malinovsky demanded that his subordinates carefully prepare each operation, conduct detailed reconnaissance of targets, and coordinate the actions of various branches of the military. Improvisation took a back seat to precise calculation. The front commander paid particular attention to the preparation of tank units. The experience of Stalingrad showed that the correct use of armored forces could determine the outcome of an operation. Tank corps were to act not only as a means of supporting the infantry, but also as an independent striking force capable of developing success deep into enemy defenses. The offensive of the Southern Front troops began in February 1943. The first major victory was the liberation of Rostov-on-Don on February 14th. The city, which Malinovsky had been forced to leave in the summer of 1942, once again came under the control of the Red Army. This had not only military, but also enormous symbolic significance. Building on their success, the front's troops moved westward, liberating one city and settlement after another in the Donbas. Unable to withstand the onslaught, the enemy began a hasty retreat, seeking to consolidate their positions on pre-prepared lines. However, the rapid pace of the Soviet advance prevented the Germans from organizing a sustainable defense. By the end of August 1943, most of the Donbas region had been liberated. Malinovsky demonstrated that Soviet military art had reached a new level of development. Operations were carried out with German precision, but on a Russian scale. The combination of careful planning and decisive execution yielded brilliant results. His successes in the Donbas brought Malinovsky well-deserved recognition as one of the outstanding commanders of the Red Army. His methods of conducting offensive operations were studied in military academies and applied by other front commanders. The liberation of Donbas opened the way for Malinovsky's troops to the borders of the Soviet Union and further into the countries of Southeast Europe. In the fall of 1943, the Colonel General took command of the Southwestern Front, and then the Third Ukrainian Front. Ahead lay the most difficult tasks of liberating the right bank of Ukraine and advancing into the Balkans. By the beginning of 1944, the strategic situation had changed dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union. The Red Army seized the strategic initiative and now dictated its will to the enemy. However, the path to final victory still had to pass through territories where the Wehrmacht had created powerful defensive lines. The first major task was to cross the Dnieper, a water barrier that the German command considered insurmountable. The enemy spent months creating a fortified line along the western bank of the river, known as the Eastern Wall. Every hill and every settlement was turned into a fortress. Malinovsky developed an operation plan based on simultaneously crossing the river in several places in order to disperse the enemy's forces. The main strike was delivered in the Zaporizhia area, where the terrain was favorable for the deployment of large tank formations. Supporting strikes were planned near Dnipropetrovsk and Nikopol. Preparations for the crossing were carried out with particular care. Engineering troops prepared crossing equipment, while artillery created firing positions to suppress enemy fortifications on the opposite bank. The Air Force was tasked with gaining air superiority and preventing the transfer of German reserves to the crossing points. The operation to cross the Dnieper began in mid-October 1943. The first assault groups crossed under cover of night and captured bridgeheads on the western bank. By morning, the crossings were operating at full capacity, transferring more and more units to the captured areas. The enemy made desperate attempts to drive the Soviet troops back across the Dnieper. German tank divisions launched counterattack after counterattack, seeking to eliminate the bridgeheads. However, Malinovsky had anticipated this development and prepared powerful anti-tank defenses in advance on the captured lines. By the end of October, the troops of the Third Ukrainian Front had firmly established themselves on the right bank of the Dnieper and began to develop an offensive into the depths. The enemy, unable to withstand the onslaught, began to retreat to the next defensive line. The way to the borders of Romania was open. The offensive in Romania required Malinovsky to solve fundamentally new tasks. Now it was necessary not only to defeat the enemy, but also to interact with local armed forces and resolve political issues related to Romania's withdrawal from the war. Soviet diplomacy worked in parallel with military operations. On August 23, 1944, a coup took place in Bucharest, as a result of which Romania withdrew from the war on the side of Germany and declared war on its former ally. Malinovsky's troops were able to develop their offensive with the support of the Romanian army. The Vienna operation became one of the most brilliant pages in the military career of Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky. In the spring of 1945, the troops of the Third Ukrainian Front were tasked with capturing the capital of Austria, a city of enormous political and strategic importance for the Third Reich. Vienna was a powerful center of resistance in the heart of Central Europe. The German command understood perfectly well that the loss of the Austrian capital would open a direct path to the borders of Germany for the Allies. Therefore, the city was turned into a real fortress with numerous fortifications and firing points. The Vienna garrison numbered about 300,000 men, including regular army units, SS troops, and the Volkssturm. The city's defenses were based on a system of concrete fortifications, anti-tank ditches, and minefields. Particularly powerful fortifications were built in the central part of the city, where government buildings and strategic facilities were located. Malinovsky understood that storming such a powerful fortress would require unconventional solutions. A direct frontal assault would lead to huge losses among the attacking troops and could drag on for months. It was necessary to find a way to break the enemy's resistance while minimizing their own losses and damage to the civilian population. The plan of operation envisaged a simultaneous attack from several directions with the aim of dividing the city's defenses into isolated sections. The main strike was to be delivered from the east, where the terrain was favorable for the use of tank units. Auxiliary strikes were planned from the north and south to prevent the enemy from transferring reserves to threatened areas. Aviation played a special role in the operation. Soviet pilots were tasked not only with supporting the ground forces' offensive, but also with paralyzing the city's transport system and disrupting communications between different sections of the defenses. At the same time, strikes against historical monuments and residential areas were strictly prohibited. The offensive on Vienna began on April 6, 1945, with a powerful artillery barrage. Hundreds of guns and mortars rained fire on German positions. At the same time, the Air Force launched massive strikes on enemy communications centers and command posts. The first days of the assault proved that the chosen tactics were correct. The German defense, deprived of unified command, was unable to offer coordinated resistance. Individual pockets of resistance were suppressed by artillery fire and airstrikes, after which they were captured by assault groups. Particularly fierce fighting took place in the city center, where the Germans had established their last line of defense. Each building had to be taken by force, clearing it floor by floor. Soviet soldiers and officers showed tremendous heroism, understanding the historical significance of the moment. On April 13, 1945, Vienna was completely liberated. The operation lasted only 7 days, a record short time for storming such a powerful fortress. The Red Army's losses were significantly lower than expected when planning the operation. May 1945 brought the long-awaited victory over Nazi Germany. But for Marshal Malinovsky, the war was not over yet. While Europe celebrated the end of hostilities, decisions were already being made in the Kremlin about the USSR's entry into the war against Japan. The Far East required the presence of an experienced commander capable of deciding the outcome of the campaign with a single lightning strike. The transfer of troops from the European theater to the Far East became one of the largest logistical operations in history. In a few months, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles had to be transported over a distance of 9,000 to 11,000 kilometers. The Trans-Siberian Railway was working at full capacity, sending train after train eastward. Malinovsky was appointed commander of the Trans-Baikal Front in July 1945. This unit was to deliver the main blow to the Japanese Kwantung Army from the territory of the Mongolian People's Republic. The task seemed extremely difficult due to the natural conditions of the upcoming theater of war. Transbaikalia and Mongolia were a land of endless steppes, deserts, and mountain ranges. In summer, the heat was unbearable, and in winter, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The vast distances between settlements and the lack of roads and water sources created enormous difficulties for supplying the troops. transporting equipment and ammunition across the Gobi Desert was particularly difficult. This lifeless territory, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, had no roads, no railways, and no sources of fresh water. Tanks and vehicles had to navigate sand dunes and rocky terrain, risking breakdown at any moment. But Malinovsky saw advantages in these difficulties. The Japanese command considered a large-scale attack across the Gobi impossible and concentrated its main reserves in other directions. If it were possible to secretly concentrate a strike force in Mongolia and suddenly launch an attack across the desert, the effect would be stunning. Preparations for the operation were carried out in strict secrecy. Troops were transferred in small groups, and movements were carried out only at night. The local population was given strict instructions not to tell anyone about the presence of Soviet troops. Even frontline officers did not know the full plan of the operation. Particular attention was paid to the logistical support for the upcoming offensive. Depots for fuel, ammunition, and food were set up deep in Mongolia. Engineering troops built roads through the desert and equipped water sources. The medical service prepared to evacuate the wounded over vast distances. Intelligence worked with particular intensity, studying the Japanese defense system in Manchuria. It was necessary to know exactly the location of enemy troops, the condition of roads and bridges, and the presence of fortifications. The success of the entire operation depended largely on the quality of intelligence information. By the beginning of August 1945, preparations were complete. A powerful group of troops had secretly gathered in Mongolia, ready to deliver a crushing blow to the enemy. Malinovsky understood that the moment of truth was approaching, the moment when all plans and calculations would be tested in real combat conditions. By the summer of 1945, the Kwantung Army was one of the most powerful military formations of the Japanese Empire. It was a veritable army state, controlling the vast territory of Manchuria and northern China. The total number of Japanese troops in the region reached 700,000, not counting the Manchurian Army and other allied formations. This formidable force was commanded by General Yasuoka Otazo, an experienced military leader who had been through the School of War in China. The Japanese command regarded Manchuria as an impregnable fortress, protected by natural barriers and a powerful system of fortifications. 17 fortified areas with a total length of more than 1,000 kilometers were created on the border with the USSR and Mongolia. These fortifications were built over many years, drawing on the experience of the European War. Concrete pillboxes and bunkers were arranged in several lines up to 200 kilometers deep. Particularly powerful fortifications were created in mountain passes and at river crossings, places where the enemy would inevitably have to concentrate their troops. Malinovsky carefully studied intelligence data on the enemy. The Japanese army had extensive experience of combat operations in the Far East and was well acquainted with the terrain and climatic features of the region. Japanese soldiers were known for their fanatical bravery and willingness to fight to the last bullet. The Japanese Air Force, based at numerous airfields in Manchuria and Korea, posed a particular threat. Although by 1945 the Japanese Air Force had been significantly weakened, it still retained the ability to inflict serious damage on the advancing Soviet troops. It was necessary to gain air superiority from the very first hours of the operation. Nature itself was no less formidable an opponent in the Far East. Manchuria was a land of contrasts, from the arid steppes of Mongolia to the impenetrable taiga forests of Primary. The main natural barrier was the greater Khingan mountain range. stretching from north to south across the entire territory. This range, up to 2,000 meters high, was covered with dense forests and cut by deep gorges. The roads through the Greater Khingan could be counted on the fingers of one hand, and all of them were under the control of Japanese troops. For tank units, the mountains were an almost insurmountable obstacle. Climatic conditions also played against the attacking side. Summers in Manchuria were characterized by unbearable heat and torrential rains that turned the roads into impassable swamps. Winters brought 40-degree frosts, which disabled equipment and froze people. The Japanese command rightly believed that these natural obstacles, combined with powerful fortifications, would make Manchuria an impregnable fortress. The defense plans envisaged a protracted war of attrition, during which the enemy would suffer huge losses and ultimately abandon the offensive. However, Malinovsky saw weaknesses in the Japanese defense system. The enemy relied too much on natural obstacles and underestimated the capabilities of modern technology. In addition, the length of the front did not allow for the creation of a continuous line of defense. Inevitably, there were areas covered only by sentries and reconnaissance. The development of the plan for the Manchurian Operation was the pinnacle of Rodion Malinovsky's strategic artistry. The plan was based on the idea of simultaneously striking several converging directions in order to divide the Japanese troops into isolated groups. This approach required precision planning and flawless coordination between the various fronts. The main strike was to be delivered by Malinovsky's Trans-Baikal Front from Mongolian territory. It was here, in the direction most unexpected by the enemy, that the most powerful group of troops was to be concentrated. The route of the offensive ran through the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan mountain range, leading Soviet troops into the heart of Manchuria. Supporting strikes were carried out from the Soviet primary region by the 1st and 2nd Far Eastern Fronts. These operations were intended to tie down Japanese reserves and prevent them from being transferred to the main strike force. At the same time, amphibious operations were planned on the coast of Korea and Sakhalin. The key element of the plan was surprise. The Japanese command was not to learn about the preparations for the offensive until the very last moment. This required exceptional secrecy in all preparations and the creation of false targets to mislead the enemy about the true direction of the main strike. Malinovsky understood that the success of the operation depended largely on the pace of the offensive. Slow progress would give the Japanese the opportunity to regroup their forces and organize a stable defense at intermediate lines. Therefore, the plan provided for the rapid advance of tank units deep into enemy defenses at a speed of up to 100 kilometers per day. Tank armies played a special role in the operation. Colonel General Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army was to be the spearhead of the main strike, breaking through Bolshaya Khingan and entering the operational space of central Manchuria. The use of large tank formations in mountainous and desert terrain was an innovative decision. The Air Force was tasked with gaining air superiority and providing direct support to the advancing troops. Soviet pilots were to destroy Japanese aircraft at airfields in the first hours of the operation, and then focus on supporting the tank formations. Transport aircraft were used to supply remote garrisons and evacuate the wounded. The logistical support for the operation required unprecedented solutions. It was necessary to create reserves of fuel, ammunition, and food sufficient to conduct combat operations for a month away from the main supply bases. Engineering troops had to ensure the crossing of tanks across numerous rivers and build roads through mountain passes. Special attention was paid to medical support. The climatic conditions of the Far East posed a threat of mass disease among personnel. The medical service developed special preventive measures, as well as a plan for the evacuation of the wounded and sick over vast distances in the absence of a developed road network. Intelligence support for the operation was provided by all types of reconnaissance. Human intelligence was tasked with establishing the exact location of Japanese troops and identifying weaknesses in the defense system. Aerial reconnaissance was tasked with studying the terrain and the condition of the roads in detail. Radio intelligence monitored the communications of the Japanese command. A special disinformation program was developed to mislead the enemy. False radio communications, simulated troop concentrations in secondary directions, and demonstrative preparations for defense were all intended to convince the Japanese that Soviet troops were not ready for an offensive. Coordinating the actions of three fronts required the creation of a single command center for the operation. The Supreme Command Headquarters sent its representatives to the Far East to ensure the coordination of all participants in the operation. Malinovsky understood that success depended on the precise execution of timetables by all fronts. By the beginning of August 1945, preparations for the operation were complete. The plan developed by Malinovsky envisaged a crushing blow to the enemy, with forces 1.5 to 2 times superior in number. If all calculations proved correct, the Japanese Kwantung Army was to be defeated within 2 to 3 weeks. On August 9, 1945, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the Manchurian strategic offensive operation began. This day became a turning point in the Pacific War and demonstrated to the whole world a new level of Soviet military art. The troops of the Trans-Baikal Front, under the command of Marshal Malinovsky, began their march across the Gobi Desert, one of the most daring maneuvers in military history. The advance units set off before dawn, taking advantage of the cool morning hours to overcome the most difficult sections of the route. The tankers of Colonel General Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army knew that they would have to cross a waterless desert where any breakdown could be fatal. However, the fighting spirit of the troops was exceptionally high. The Gobi Desert greeted the advancing troops with scorching heat and treacherous sandstorms. The air temperature rose above 50 degrees, and the hot sand burned their hands and faces. The tanks turned into real ovens, inside which it was almost impossible to breathe. Mechanics and drivers lost consciousness from the heat, but their comrades brought them to their senses and continued on. The main problem was supplying the troops with water and fuel. Every liter of fresh water was worth its weight in gold in the desert. Tanks consumed enormous amounts of fuel when moving on sand, and fuel reserves were dwindling at a catastrophic rate. The rear services worked to the limit of human capabilities, delivering the necessary supplies to the front lines. Despite all the difficulties, the pace of the offensive remained high. During the first day, the tank units advanced 80 to 100 kilometers, significantly exceeding all pre-war standards. Japanese intelligence failed to detect the start of the offensive in time, which gave the Soviet troops a tactical surprise. The second day of the operation brought new challenges. Sandstorms began, sharply limiting visibility and making it difficult to navigate the terrain. Radio communications were intermittent due to electrical discharges in the atmosphere. Many units lost contact with their higher headquarters and were forced to act independently. It was during these critical hours that the best qualities of the Soviet commanders came to the fore. Colonels and lieutenant colonels took responsibility for making decisions in a difficult situation. They understood the overall plan of the operation and acted within its framework. without waiting for specific orders from higher command. By the end of the third day, the advance units had reached the foothills of Bolshoi Khingan. Here, a new challenge awaited them: climbing mountain roads, many of which existed only on the General Staff's maps. The tanks had to overcome steep slopes, where the slightest mistake by the driver could result in a fall into the abyss. The Japanese command finally understood the scale of the threat. General Yasuoka gave the order to transfer reserves to the threatened direction, but it was already too late. Soviet tankers were ahead of all enemy calculations and were inexorably approaching strategically important objects in the depths of Manchuria. The breakthrough through the Greater Khingan mountain range was the culminating moment of the entire Manchurian Operation. These ancient mountains, covered with dense forests and cut by deep gorges, seemed an insurmountable obstacle for tank formations. The Japanese command was convinced that mechanized troops would never be able to force such difficult terrain in combat conditions. However, Marshal Malinovsky and his subordinates carefully studied all possible routes through the mountains. Soviet scouts spent months surveying mountain trails, identifying the most passable sections, and determining where tank units could be deployed. Engineering troops prepared explosives in advance to widen particularly narrow passages. The ascent began in the pre-dawn hours of August 11th. The tanks moved in a single file, with large intervals between vehicles. Every turn of the mountain road could be the last. Below lay chasms hundreds of meters deep. The drivers used all their skills to keep the multi-ton vehicles on the narrow road. The section near the Kilar-Ganchur Pass, where the road climbed a steep slope in a serpentine pattern, proved to be particularly difficult. Several tanks fell into the abyss here, but the rest continued on, knowing that stopping would mean the failure of the entire operation. Sappers blew up rocky outcrops, widening the road for heavy equipment to pass. Japanese troops attempted to organize defenses in the mountain passes, but were caught off guard by the sudden appearance of Soviet tanks in places that were considered inaccessible. The enemy's few barricades were unable to hold back the rapid advance and were swept away or bypassed from the flanks. By the evening of August 11th, the advance units of the 6th Guards Tank Army had reached the eastern slopes of the ridge. Below lay the Manchurian plain with its endless fields and sparse settlements. Here, Soviet tankers could take full advantage of their equipment and tactical training. The descent from the mountains proved to be no less dangerous than the ascent. Heavy tanks developed tremendous speed on steep slopes, and it took exceptional skill to keep the vehicle under control. The braking systems were working at their limits, and the brake pads were red-hot from constant braking. But all the difficulties paid off handsomely when the tank columns broke out onto the plain. Here, they found open terrain, where they could deploy the full power of their mechanized units. The Japanese did not expect the appearance of large tank forces in this area and did not prepare appropriate anti-tank defenses. On August 12th, Soviet tanks began a rapid advance across the Manchurian plain. The pace of the offensive reached 120 kilometers per day, an unprecedented rate in mountainous and desert terrain. Japanese garrisons did not have time to organize their defenses and either surrendered or retreated hastily. The breakthrough at Bolshaya Khingan became a turning point in the entire operation. The Japanese command realized that the Manchurian defense system had collapsed and that it was impossible to restore the front. A panicked retreat began, which soon turned into a complete collapse of organized resistance. The rapid advance of Soviet troops across the Manchurian plain turned into a veritable Soviet-style blitzkrieg. Malinovsky's tank units demonstrated a rate of advance that surpassed even the best examples of German tank operations at the beginning of the war. In 4 days, from August 12th to 15th, the troops of the Trans-Baikal Front advanced more than 400 kilometers. The key to success was the excellent organization of cooperation between the various branches of the armed forces. Tank corps operated in close cooperation with motorized rifle units and artillery. The Air Force provided air cover and conducted reconnaissance ahead of the advancing columns. Such coordination was the result of many years of combat experience gained in the battles of the Great Patriotic War. The skillful use of the terrain played a special role in the success of the operation. The Manchurian plain, with its wide valleys and sparse population, was ideal for the operations of large tank formations. Soviet commanders avoided head-on collisions with fortified positions, preferring to bypass them from the flanks and attack the enemy from the rear. The psychological impact of the sudden appearance of Soviet tanks deep behind enemy lines was staggering. Japanese garrisons, unprepared to repel tank attacks, often surrendered without resistance. Many fortified positions, which had taken years to build, were captured within a few hours. On August 13th, the advanced units of the 6th Guards Tank Army reached the Khalkha-Gol-Solan Railway, which was the most important communication line for Japanese troops in central Manchuria. The capture of this highway deprived the enemy of the ability to maneuver reserves and supply the surrounded garrisons. At the same time, Soviet troops continued their advance towards major cities. On August 14th, Dolanor was liberated, and on August 15th, Khingan. Each captured city became a stronghold for the further development of the offensive and a supply base for the advanced units. The Japanese command made desperate attempts to halt the Soviet advance. Aircraft and a few reserves were thrown against the tank columns. However, scattered counterattacks could not stop the avalanche of Soviet troops rolling across the Manchurian plain with increasing force. Particularly dramatic events unfolded in the area around the city of Zehe, where the Japanese attempted to organize a stubborn defense. Soviet tankers, not wanting to waste time on a siege, employed a deep flanking tactic. Part of the forces continued to block the city, while the main forces bypassed it and continued their advance, leaving the garrison completely surrounded. By the end of August 15th, it became clear that the Japanese Kwantung Army had ceased to exist as an organized force. Individual units still offered resistance, but there was no longer a united front. Soviet troops cut the enemy's defenses into many isolated pockets that were unable to coordinate their actions. The success of the operation exceeded all expectations. What was planned to be completed in 2 to 3 weeks was achieved in just 6 days of active combat. The speed and decisiveness of the Soviet offensive were unprecedented in the military history of the Far East. On August 16, 1945, sensational news spread around the world. Emperor Hirohito of Japan announced his country's surrender. But in Manchuria, the war continued for several more days, as many Japanese commanders did not believe in the reality of what was happening and continued to resist. Marshal Malinovsky had to complete the defeat of the Kwantung Army and accept the surrender of its remnants. The announcement of Japan's surrender presented the Soviet command with a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, continuing active combat operations could lead to unjustified losses among personnel. On the other hand, it was necessary to complete the encirclement and disarmament of Japanese troops, many of whom were still combat-ready and could pose a threat. Malinovsky decided to continue the offensive until the tasks were fully accomplished. Soviet troops were to occupy all key points in Manchuria and force Japanese garrisons to surrender unconditionally. This was the right strategy, as many Japanese commanders were preparing for prolonged resistance in the mountainous areas. On August 17th, the advanced units of the Trans-Baikal Front reached the approaches to Mukden, one of the largest cities in Manchuria and the most important industrial center in the region. The headquarters of the Kwantung Army was located here, and significant Japanese forces were concentrated. The capture of the city was not only of military, but also of enormous political significance. The assault on Mukden began at dawn on August 18th. Soviet troops used the tactic of simultaneous attacks from several directions to prevent the enemy from organizing a coordinated defense. Tank units broke through to the city center, while motorized rifle units cleared the neighborhoods of the remaining Japanese troops. By noon on August 18th, resistance in Mukden had been broken. The commander of the Kwantung Army, General Yasuoka Otazo, was taken prisoner along with his staff. This marked the symbolic end of the Japanese military machine in Manchuria, an army that had once terrorized all of East Asia. At the same time, Soviet troops were advancing in other directions. Troops of the First Far Eastern Front liberated Port Arthur and Dairen, eliminating the last pockets of Japanese resistance on the Liaodong Peninsula. The Second Far Eastern Front completed the liberation of northern Manchuria and began operations in Korea. On August 19th, a solemn ceremony was held to mark the surrender of the remnants of the Kwantung Army. Representatives of the Japanese command, in the presence of Soviet officers, signed an act of unconditional surrender of all troops in Manchuria. It was a triumph for Soviet military art and for Marshal Malinovsky personally. The results of the Manchurian Operation exceeded all expectations. In 10 days of active combat, the million-strong Japanese army was completely defeated. A huge territory was liberated, and dozens of cities and industrial centers were captured. The losses of the Red Army were relatively small, less than 12,000 killed and wounded. The capture of more than 500,000 Japanese soldiers was the largest surrender in the history of the Pacific War. Many of them would work for many years to rebuild the Soviet Union, which had been destroyed by the war, contributing to post-war reconstruction. The Kwantung Army, once a formidable force of Japanese imperialism, disappeared forever from the political map of the world. The Manchurian Operation went down in history as one of the most brilliant examples of strategic artistry of the 20th century. In just 10 days, Soviet troops under the command of Marshal Malinovsky decided the outcome of the war in the Far East, demonstrating to the world a new level of military art. This operation was a worthy conclusion to the military career of one of the greatest commanders of the Great Patriotic War. The lessons of the Manchurian Operation were studied in military academies around the world. Soviet military theorists created a new concept of warfare in special climatic and geographical conditions. The experience of crossing the Gobi Desert and breaking through the greater Khingan mountain range demonstrated the capabilities of modern military technology when used skillfully. Careful preparation of the operation was a key factor in its success. Months of covert troop concentration, detailed reconnaissance of the terrain, and the creation of material reserves all ensured strategic surprise. Until the last moment, the Japanese command did not believe in the possibility of a large-scale offensive through territories that were considered impassable. Equally important was the moral and psychological preparation of the troops. Soviet soldiers and officers went into battle knowing that they were participating in a historic operation that would put an end to World War II. This moral factor compensated for all the difficulties of marching through the desert and mountains. The Manchurian Operation demonstrated the superiority of the Soviet military school over the Japanese. While the Japanese relied on strong defenses and the use of natural obstacles, the Soviet command managed to find unconventional solutions that turned these obstacles to their advantage. The suddenness of the strike across the desert came as a complete surprise to the enemy. The results of the operation had far-reaching political consequences. The defeat of the Kwantung Army hastened Japan's surrender and prevented the need for an Allied landing on the Japanese islands, which could have cost millions of lives. The Soviet Union demonstrated its military power and established its influence in the Far East region. Marshal Malinovsky's personal contribution to the success of the operation cannot be overestimated. His strategic thinking, ability to make unconventional decisions, and skill in organizing the interaction of various branches of the armed forces were decisive factors in the victory. The military leader, who had gone from defending Stalingrad to defeating the Japanese in Manchuria, proved his right to be called one of the best commanders of his time. After the end of the war, Malinovsky continued to serve his country in high military and government posts. He became Minister of Defense of the USSR and made a significant contribution to strengthening the country's defense capabilities in the context of the beginning of the Cold War. The experience he gained during the Great Patriotic War and the war with Japan helped him to successfully solve new tasks. The Manchurian Operation remains an unsurpassed example of military art. It continues to be studied in modern military academies, and the principles laid down by Malinovsky as the basis for this operation are still relevant to military science today. History has shown that the talent of a commander, combined with the courage of soldiers, can work wonders even in the most difficult conditions. The name of Marshal Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky is forever inscribed in gold letters in the history of Russian military art. His path from a simple peasant son to one of the greatest commanders of the 20th century serves as an example for new generations of defenders of the fatherland.